At my mother's birthday party, the room went silent when she lifted her glass and said that my sister Lauren was the only one who kept our family alive. Every eye turned to her as if the past 6 years and the $120,000 I had sent never existed. My hands shook, but I stood up and told them if they believed Lauren carried everything, then from that night on, she could carry it all, because I was done paying. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 32, I had been living in Austin for nearly a decade, building a career as a software engineer, and sending home $2,000 every month without fail. From 2018 until the end of 2023, I wired the money sometimes for going little comforts for myself, so that my parents in Columbus would never have to choose between rent groceries or my father's medication. My mother never learned how to use online banking. She said it was confusing and unsafe, so my sister Lauren insisted she would handle it. She was 35, 3 years older, always presented as the golden child, and she said she would make sure every dollar reached our parents. I believed her because I wanted to believe family still meant trust. That December, we gathered at my parents' modest house, a mix of siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles. The smell of roast ham drifted from the kitchen, laughter echoed through the hallway, and I carried in a tray of pies I had bought on the way from Austin. The living room buzzed with chatter, my Aunt Carol recounting some story, Uncle Robert holding a beer and chuckling. I slipped my coat off and sat quietly near the corner, listening more than speaking the way I usually did. My father sat in his recliner, thinner than I remembered his face, tired from the strain of his heart medication. As everyone raised glasses to toast my mother's 61st birthday, she cleared her throat. The room quieted. All eyes turned to her pearl necklace glinting under the chandelier. She smiled, and then her words cut through the air like a knife. Lauren is the one who truly takes care of this family. She pays for your father's medicine, she keeps us afloat. Without her, we would not manage. The words hit me with a cold weight. I felt my cheeks heat and my hands clench under the table. Only last week I had paid the hospital bill in Austin before flying out here, watching the charge hit my account. My mouth opened, but the words refused to form. Around the table, heads nodded. My aunt smiled warmly at Lauren, who sat straight-backed, accepting the praise as if it were her right. Uncle Robert raised his glass and said proudly, "Lauren really is the one carrying the whole family. She has stepped up in ways few daughters would." I looked across the table at Lauren. She gave a modest shrug. Her lips curled just slightly, almost a smirk, hidden beneath a polite expression. My father nodded slowly, saying nothing, his silence more painful than if he had denied me outright. I wanted to speak, to shout, to slam my phone on the table and show every transfer, but the words locked inside me. I heard the scrape of forks on plates, laughter, resuming, someone turning up the holiday music. But for me, the air had thickened into something hard to breathe. My chest ached, my stomach knotted. Every memory of late nights coding overtime, every skipped trip or indulgence, so I could wire the money, all of it compressed into that single moment where my mother's smile erased me. I excused myself quietly and walked into the kitchen, gripping the counter until my knuckles whitened. From the other room, I heard them still praising Lauren, still convinced she was the one keeping the house upright. My throat burned with words unsaid. For years I had let them see me as the independent one, the self-sufficient child who did not need recognition. Tonight that lie pressed against my ribs so fiercely, I thought I might break. I splashed cold water on my face, looked at my reflection in the window above the sink, and forced myself to breathe. When I returned to the table, Lauren was laughing with my cousins, recounting how she had negotiated a deal for my mother's prescriptions. They hung on her every word. I sat down, folded my napkin, and smiled faintly, though inside I was unraveling. As the evening wound down and coats were gathered, my aunt hugged Lauren tightly and said, "You really are the savior of this family." Lauren beamed, and my mother patted her hand with pride. I walked out into the cold Ohio night, my breath clouding in the air, and I understood that in their eyes my years of sacrifice had vanished, absorbed into Lauren's image. The street lamps glowed over patches of snow as I reached my car. I sat behind the wheel, hands trembling, heart pounding, with a mix of anger and sorrow. I started the engine, the hum filling the silence, and stared at the dashboard lights. The truth pressed against me with clarity I could no longer ignore. My effort had been invisible, my love had been misattributed, and the shadow of the golden child had just swallowed me whole. January brought a quiet cold to Austin, the kind that settled into the bones even when the sun shone bright. I was at my desk when my manager called me into a glass-walled conference room and handed me a certificate with my name printed in bold. Our project had launched ahead of schedule, and the client was thrilled. Along with the recognition came a bonus more than I expected. My coworkers clapped Jessica, my colleague patted my back, and for a moment I felt seen, really seen. I drove home that night with a small smile, thinking maybe this year would be different. The next morning, my phone lit up with a call from Columbus. My mother's voice came through heavy and sharp. She said, "Your father's prescription costs are piling up and we can't keep up." She sighed, almost accusatory, as if reminding me of my duty. I assured her I would send money, even though I had already wired funds days earlier. I promised to check the account again after work. When the call ended, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. Something felt off, like two puzzle pieces that refused to fit together. That evening, scrolling through my phone to distract myself, a post from Lauren popped up. Her face glowed under Florida sunlight, a pair of oversized sunglasses perched on her head. Behind her stretched a white sand beach, and in the caption, she bragged about a week of much-needed rest. In another photo, she leaned casually against a brand-new black SUV, a designer handbag hanging from her arm. I froze, staring at the images. The money I had sent, the money my parents still claimed, was never enough, seemed to have transformed into luxury that I knew Lauren could not afford on her part-time work alone. The unease inside me tightened. I called my mother later that week, my voice careful. I asked if she had received the last transfer, if everything was okay. She chuckled softly and said, "Yes, but we still struggle, Sarah. You should try to live more simply like your sister. She knows how to stretch every dollar." Her words pierced like glass. I wanted to shout that the SUV in Lauren's driveway was not frugality, that the Florida photos were not sacrifice, but the words stuck in my throat. I ended the call politely, my hands trembling as I hung up. That night, I sat with Michael, my boyfriend, in our small apartment. He noticed my silence and asked what was wrong. I told him what I had seen online, what my mother had said. He leaned forward, brows furrowed, and said, "Sarah, does your mom know you are the one paying?" I nodded slowly, but even as I did, doubt crept in. What if they all believed Lauren? What if every check I had written had been swallowed by her smile and turned into her glory? Michael squeezed my hand, his voice firm. "Then you need to find proof. You can't keep bleeding money while she takes the credit." A week later, a message appeared in the family group chat. "Thank you, Lauren, for covering Dad's appointment. We're so grateful." The words glowed on my screen like a brand. My heart pounded as cousins added hearts and clapping emojis. My aunt chimed in with a line about how Lauren had always been reliable. I sat still, staring at my phone, my throat tight. My name was nowhere in that stream of gratitude. I placed the phone face down and leaned back, the ceiling spinning above me. The weight of silence pressed heavier than words could. I had no proof yet, only suspicions. But each day, the line between sacrifice and betrayal blurred sharply. I swallowed my anger and told myself to wait to watch, because sooner or later, the truth would surface. What I did not know then was how quickly the cracks would widen, how one hospital visit would tear open everything I had tried so hard to ignore. In March, my father collapsed in the living room, clutching his chest, and the ambulance rushed him to Riverside Hospital in Columbus. I booked the first flight I could, and by the time I arrived, he was lying in a narrow bed, hooked to monitors, his skin pale under the fluorescent lights. The nurse asked about billing, and without hesitation, I gave her my card. She typed my name, swiped the payment, and handed me the receipt. It was routine for me, another line of numbers on my account, another silent sacrifice. That evening, the family gathered at my parents' house. The mood was heavy, but not solemn. My mother moved from chair to chair, thanking people for prayers. When the subject of the hospital came up, she smiled proudly at Lauren and said in front of everyone, Lauren has been such a blessing, she even paid for your father's care. The words rang in my ears. I had the receipt folded in my purse, my signature in black ink, yet the credit landed neatly at my sister's feet. My cousins nodded, my aunt clapped her hands together, and Lauren tilted her head with a soft grin like she had truly earned it. I excused myself and stepped onto the porch, the cold March air cutting through my coat. My phone buzzed with a message from Michael. He had called earlier asking for updates. I typed back that my father was stable, but my chest felt heavy with more than worry. Michael called instead of replying. His voice was calm but firm. "Sarah, you need to look at your records. If Lauren has been funneling the money, Medicare will never accept that arrangement. You could be on the hook for fraud you never committed." His words jolted me. I had been so focused on hurt pride that I had not considered the legal danger. That night in my childhood bedroom, I sat cross-legged on the bed, the glow of my phone illuminating my face. I opened my bank app and scrolled. Transfer after transfer, month after month, 6 full years, $2,000 each time, sometimes more, when bills spiked. The total stared back at me, over $120,000. My stomach clenched. All of it had gone into Lauren's account. Every dime I thought was easing my parents' burden had passed through her hands. My fingers shook as I dialed the neighborhood pharmacy where Dad's prescriptions were filled. A tired-sounding clerk picked up. I asked who usually paid for Thomas Mitchell's medication. There was a pause as she checked. Then she said softly, "According to our records, it has always been you, Miss Mitchell. Your card, your payments." My throat tightened, my hand gripping the phone so hard it hurt. "Thank you," I managed before hanging up. The house was quiet when I walked back down the hallway. In the living room, Lauren was laughing softly with my mother, her voice low but full of confidence. I watched from the doorway, the weight of betrayal pressing on my chest. Every sacrifice I had made, every hour I had worked overtime, every holiday I had skipped to cover expenses had been rewritten in their minds as Lauren's generosity. My name had been erased even when it was printed on receipts. I went back upstairs, sat at the edge of the bed, and stared at the numbers on the screen again. $120,000. 6 years of my life. I thought of the SUV gleaming in Lauren's driveway, the vacation pictures on her feed, the handbags dangling from her arm. The truth was no longer hidden. It was staring at me in black and white, undeniable, brutal. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle. Anger burned hot under my skin, but alongside it came a clarity I had never felt before. I could no longer pretend ignorance. The evidence was there, and sooner or later the entire family would see it. I only had to decide when to reveal it and how much destruction the truth would bring. The house was dressed in ribbons and gold balloons, the dining table covered with cakes and casseroles, and 40 voices filled the air with chatter. My mother was radiant in a navy dress, pearls shining at her neck, accepting hugs and gifts as if she were a queen. I carried a bouquet into the crowded living room, weaving between cousins and neighbors. Mrs. Parker, the woman who had lived next door for 3 decades, greeted me warmly, though her eyes flicked quickly toward Lauren, who was already surrounded by admirers. Dinner stretched long with wine and stories, the air thick with the smell of roast chicken and garlic. My father sat quietly in his chair, his smile tired, but present. I tried to focus on him, but my stomach tightened. As I saw my sister lift her glass, whispering with an aunt about a new business opportunity she claimed she was helping my parents manage. Each lie tasted like vinegar on my tongue, but I said nothing. I waited. When the cake was cut and everyone held a glass of champagne, my mother stood at the head of the table. She tapped her glass lightly until the room fell silent. Her eyes gleamed as she looked from one guest to another. Then she said clearly, "Sarah will never be like Lauren. Lauren is the one who carries this family. Without her, we would not survive." The words sliced cleanly through me. Every conversation I had rehearsed in silence pressed against my chest. For a moment I felt the old instinct to swallow it down to stay quiet. Instead, I placed my glass on the table and rose to my feet. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled at my sides. If Lauren carries everything, then let her carry it all. From this day on, I will stop sending money. Gasps rippled through the room. Mrs. Parker's fork clattered against her plate. My aunt froze mid-sip. I looked straight at my mother, then at Lauren, who paled under the chandelier light. She forced a laugh and shook her head. "Sarah, you are being dramatic," she stammered. "Everyone knows I just handle things better." I held her gaze. "No, Lauren. For 90 days, I will not send a single dollar. Every bill, every prescription, every emergency will rest on your shoulders. Then we will see who truly supports this family." The silence deepened, the kind that vibrates in the bones. My father shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. My mother blinked as if she had misheard. Lauren opened her mouth again, her voice thinner this time. "That is not fair. You cannot just walk away." I folded my arms, grounding myself in the weight of the choice I had carried for years. "I already have. 90 days. That is all. If you are the backbone, then stand tall." No one moved. No one spoke. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant barking of a neighbor's dog broke the air. I sat down slowly, heart racing, but face calm. I had thrown the first stone into the still water, and the ripples were already spreading. Somewhere inside me, a strange calm replaced the years of suffocating silence. They could call me selfish, they could call me cruel, but they would no longer call me invisible. What I did not know was how quickly that silence would turn to confrontation, and how fast the truth would demand to be shown in front of every single one of them. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, my heart steady now, in a way it had not been for years. The television mounted on the wall loomed above the dining table, its black screen reflecting the stunned faces of my family. I tapped the AirPlay icon, and the room flickered as my screen appeared bright against the shadows. Rows of numbers filled the screen. Dates, amounts, and the name of the account they were sent to. $2,000, $2,000, $2,000. 6 years of sacrifice stacked like bricks. Gasps scattered around the table. My Aunt Carol leaned forward, squinting her hand frozen halfway to her glass. Uncle Robert muttered under his breath, counting the lines. Mrs. Parker pressed her lips together and shook her head slowly. I scrolled further down, my finger gliding across the phone, revealing the grand total. More than $120,000, all from me, all into Lauren's account. My mother's voice cracked as she spoke. "What is this supposed to prove, Sarah?" My pulse thudded in my ears, but my voice stayed even. "That the money you thought came from Lauren never did. Every payment came from me." I opened another folder, and the pharmacy bills appeared, each one stamped with my name. Hospital receipts followed clear as daylight. Thomas Mitchell paid by Sarah Mitchell. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the heater. My cousin dropped his fork with a sharp clink. Carol exhaled loudly. "I remember," she said slowly. "I saw you hand envelopes to your mother last Christmas." Robert nodded. "I watched you pay at the clinic when your dad was admitted." Mrs. Parker spoke up, her voice firm. "Sarah has always been the one bringing groceries, the one who stops by after work with bags. We all knew it. Maybe we just let ourselves forget." Lauren's face drained of color. She laughed weakly, the sound brittle. "I was only keeping it safe," she stammered. "Mom does not understand online accounts. I never meant to take credit." The words stumbled out, but her eyes darted toward the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. My mother finally turned toward her confusion, twisting into something darker. "Is that true, Lauren? Did you use your sister's money?" Lauren opened her mouth, then shut it again. No answer came. The silence stretched until it broke under my father's voice, low and hoarse. He looked at me, then at her, then at the numbers still glowing on the television. For a long time, he said nothing. His shoulders sagged, and his hands trembled slightly on the arms of his chair. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling past her fingers. She reached for me but stopped short, as if afraid her touch would only wound further. Around the table, whispers rose, cousins shifting uncomfortably, aunts and uncles, avoiding Lauren's eyes. The careful facade of our family cracked open in real time, and the weight of 6 years of deception hung in the air. Lauren finally whispered, I was just trying to help, but the words fell flat. No one nodded. No one believed. The spotlight that had always belonged to her turned harsh, exposing every lie. For the first time in my life, I watched the golden child shrink in her chair, stripped of the illusion she had lived in. I closed the files and the television went black. The silence remained heavy and suffocating. I sat down, my chest heaving though my face stayed calm. I had not planned to reveal it this way, but there was no turning back now. The truth had been spoken into the room, undeniable and raw. What none of them realized yet was that I was not finished. The numbers were only the beginning, and the consequences of my decision to cut them off had only just begun to unfold. That night, after the guests left, I sat at my desk in Austin and drafted an email that had been forming in my head for weeks. The words came out steady. I will be stopping all financial support for at least 90 days, effective immediately. If I decide to help in the future, all payments will go directly to the hospital or pharmacy, not through Lauren. I hit send and closed the laptop. For the first time in years, I slept without setting an alarm to remind me about transfer dates. Within 2 weeks, the silence broke. A bill from Riverside Hospital bounced back because my card had been removed from automatic payment. The next morning, my mother called me in a panic, her voice sharp. "The hospital says they have not received payment." I answered calmly, "You will need to forward that to Lauren now." She sputtered, unable to form words, then hung up. Days later, the pharmacy left a message on my voicemail. "Miss Mitchell, your father's account is past due." The card on file was declined. "If there is another responsible party, we will need their information." I called them back and said the responsible party is not me anymore. "Please call my sister Lauren." The clerk hesitated before replying that they would update the file. My phone buzzed later that night. Lauren's name lit the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was high and tight. "Sarah, what are you doing? The pharmacy says your card was declined." I reminded her of the email. "I told you I am no longer the one paying. You wanted the recognition, now you have the responsibility." There was silence, then she snapped. "Do you have any idea how hard this is?" I laughed quietly. "Yes, I know exactly how hard. I carried it for 6 years. She begged then, her tone shifting. "Just this once, can you cover it until I figure things out?" I closed my eyes and pictured every bonus I had used for their bills, every vacation I had skipped, every hour of overtime I had poured into her illusion. Then I opened a browser, copied the links for Medicare and Medicaid enrollment, and sent them in a text. "Figure it out, Lauren. That is your job now." For days after, messages trickled in from relatives who had been at the party. Some tried to stay neutral, others whispered apologies, a few even praised me for finally standing up. My mother, however, called again and again, each time with more urgency, her voice cracking. "Sarah, your father needs his prescriptions." I answered the same every time. "Lauren is responsible. Ask her." The weight began to shift. For the first time in years, my shoulders felt light. I walked into work without the gnawing thought of bills waiting for me. I sat with Michael over dinner and actually tasted the food. He asked if I was sure about the line I had drawn. I nodded. This is the only way they will ever understand. By the end of the month, Lauren's facade started to crumble. She tried juggling credit cards, begged friends for short-term loans, and even listed a few handbags online. None of it was enough. The hospital demanded payment, the pharmacy stopped releasing medication, until the balance was cleared. My mother left me a tearful voicemail begging me to reconsider. I did not call back. Then one Friday night, Lauren called again, her voice stripped of all pretense. "Sarah, I cannot do this. They are going to cut off Dad's meds. Please, just help me." I listened without speaking, then forwarded her the same links I had already sent, adding a note. "These programs exist for people who qualify. Apply now." She tried to argue, but I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the table and exhaled. For once, I did not feel like the invisible daughter cleaning up everyone else's mess. I felt like someone drawing a map of boundaries in bold ink. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of what they would have to face once the safety net I had built was completely gone. Michael sat with me at the kitchen table one Saturday morning, spreading out a stack of papers across the wood surface. They were Medicaid forms thick with fine print, but his hands moved through them like a man who had done this before. He looked at me and said softly, "Let me help your dad file these. It is the only way they will stop drowning." I nodded, and together we filled every blank, gathered every medical note, and mailed the packet off. 2 weeks later, the letter came back approved. My father's prescriptions would now be covered. The calls from my mother shifted after that. Less frantic, more subdued. She never thanked me directly, but I could hear the change in her tone, the way her voice softened when she mentioned my father's appointments. It was Michael's guidance that had given them breathing room, not Lauren's. Meanwhile, Lauren's life began to change in quieter, humbler ways. She had applied to a small design studio downtown, a place that did marketing flyers and local event posters. They hired her at entry level. The golden child who once flaunted vacations and handbags now texted me photos of her cubicle, perhaps hoping I would approve. At the end of her first month, she sent my parents $200, a fraction of what I used to give, but at least it was hers. Work carried me forward too. In June, I traveled to Houston for the annual tech conference. I had been invited to present with my team about our breakthrough project. I stood on stage under the bright lights speaking into the microphone as hundreds of faces watched. When the applause came, it rolled through me like a wave I had never known. A colleague recorded my speech and posted it online. By the next week, the clip had made its way back to Columbus. My mother called one evening, her voice small. "I saw the video, Sarah. You spoke so well." There was a pause and then almost a whisper. "I was wrong about you." I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, the quiet on the line heavier than words. She did not apologize fully, but those 5 words carried more weight than years of silence. Later that summer, I drove back to Ohio for a family dinner. Only my parents, Lauren, and I sat at the table. The air smelled of fried chicken and biscuits, but conversation was careful. My father kept glancing at me as if measuring the moment. When dessert was finished, he set his fork down, folded his hands, and met my eyes. "Sarah, I owe you an apology." His voice cracked on the word. "I should have defended you. I should have seen the truth. Thank you for carrying us when I could not." The room fell into stillness. My mother dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Lauren shifted uncomfortably, and no one clapped or cheered. It was not that kind of moment. The silence was thick, but inside it, there was something undeniable. Justice had been spoken out loud, even if softly. I leaned back, the weight that had sat on my chest for years lifting little by little. For the first time, I did not feel like a shadow in my own family. I was no longer invisible, and they all knew it. Yet even then, I understood this was not the end of the story. Recognition had come, but boundaries still needed to be held, and the test of whether they truly respected me was still to come. The weeks that followed felt different. The storm had passed, but instead of slipping back into old patterns, I kept the line I had drawn bright and sharp. When bills came due, I did not wire money into Lauren's account. If my parents needed help, I paid hospitals or pharmacies directly. Nothing hidden, nothing filtered through someone else. They learned quickly that my support came only with transparency. There were fewer calls filled with panic, fewer accusations. Slowly, their tone shifted from demand to gratitude, though always in measured words. Lauren's life adjusted too. She no longer had the cushion of my money to fall back on. She kept her job at the design studio, arriving early and staying late. I heard from Mrs. Parker that she even started taking on freelance projects, something I had never imagined her doing before. When she managed to send our parents a small check one month, it was her own, and though it was only a few $100s, it carried more weight than anything she had funneled from me. Watching her stand on her own feet was strange, almost unfamiliar, but necessary. By autumn, I decided it was time for a different kind of gathering. Michael and I planned a dinner at our apartment in Austin. We set the table with simple dishes, roasted chicken, and vegetables, nothing extravagant but warm. I invited my parents, a few close friends, and Jessica from work. When they arrived, the air carried a quiet caution, but the evening unfolded gently. My mother complimented the meal. My father asked Michael about his cases. and Lauren, who had traveled down, reluctantly spoke of her job without the boastful tone that used to follow her. As we cleared the plates, I looked around the table. For years I had chased their approval with money, believing sacrifice alone could buy respect. Now the room felt different. The love was quiet or stripped of illusions, but it was real because it was bounded. No one asked for favors, no one demanded more than I could give. Later after dessert, my father raised his glass. He did not give a speech, but his eyes met mine and held steady. That small gesture carried more meaning than any words. I smiled not out of victory, but out of peace. When the night ended and I watched my parents walk out into the cool Texas evening, I felt something settle inside me. For the first time, I was not defined by what I gave away, but by the boundaries I held. The golden child image had cracked, and in its place stood the truth we had all ignored for too long. As I closed the door and leaned against it, Michael wrapped an arm around me and whispered, "You finally got justice." I nodded, though, in my heart, I knew it was not about revenge. It was about balance, about finally being seen for who I was, and refusing to disappear again. And so I will leave you with this thought. If it were you, would you be willing to set financial boundaries with your own family in order to find justice for yourself?